The crying sounds. Ethan lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep. It was a quiet night, but something felt off. The moonlight crept through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. But instead of the usual peace, a faint sound echoed through the house. It was soft at first, like a whisper in the wind. Then it grew louder. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the sound. It was his sister, Mia, crying. Every night for the past few weeks, Ethan had heard the same thing. At first, he thought it was just a bad dream, or maybe Mia was just upset about something. But as the nights went on, he started to realize that this was no ordinary crying. There was something different about it, something that made Ethan feel uneasy. Mia wasn't a kid who cried easily. Sure, she was only 10, but she was strong and usually happy. She didn't let much get to her. So when Ethan heard her sobbing in the middle of the night, he knew something wasn't right. The house was quiet except for the muffled sobs coming from Mia's room down the hall. Ethan tried to ignore it, telling himself that she would be fine in the morning. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He tossed and turned, trying to block out the sound, but it wouldn't stop. It was as if the crying was getting louder, pulling him in. The next morning, when Ethan saw Mia at breakfast, she seemed perfectly fine. She was eating her cereal, chatting with her mom about school, and laughing at something on the TV. There was no sign of the tears that had filled the night before. Ethan decided not to ask her about it. Maybe she was just going through something personal, and she didn't want to talk about it. But as the days passed, the crying continued. Every night, it echoed through the house. Ethan started to lose sleep. His eyes were heavy during the day, and he found it harder to concentrate at school. He needed answers. One evening after dinner, Ethan decided he couldn't ignore it anymore. He waited until their parents had gone to bed, and then he quietly slipped out of his room and into the hallway. He stood outside Mia's door, listening closely. The crying was soft at first, but it was definitely there. It sounded like she was trying to hold it back, but the sadness kept breaking through. Ethan's heart raced. He couldn't just keep pretending like nothing was happening. He knocked lightly on her door. "Mia," he called softly. "Are you okay?" The crying stopped immediately, and for a moment there was silence. Ethan held his breath, waiting for her to answer. "Mia," he said again, this time a little louder. "Please, let me in." After a long pause, the door creaked open, and Mia's tear-streaked face appeared. Her eyes were red, and she looked tired. Ethan could see that she had been crying for a while. She wiped her eyes quickly and forced a smile, but Ethan could see through it. She was hiding something. "I'm fine, Ethan," Mia said in a shaky voice, trying to sound convincing. Just had a bad dream." Ethan wasn't convinced. He could feel that something was off. Mia was trying to act like everything was okay, but he knew better. "Mia, you've been crying every night. You're not fine. Please, tell me what's going on," he said, his voice filled with concern. Mia hesitated. She looked away, and for a moment, Ethan thought she wasn't going to say anything. But then she sighed and lowered her head. "I don't want to talk about it," she whispered. "I don't want anyone to know." Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest. His sister, the girl he had grown up with, was hurting, and she didn't want anyone to help. It didn't make sense. He wanted to understand, to make her feel safe again, but Mia was pushing him away. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken words. "Mia," Ethan said gently, "you don't have to go through this alone. Whatever it is, I'm here for you." Mia looked up at him, her eyes full of fear and sadness. "I know you want to help, Ethan," she whispered, "but I can't. It's just too much." Ethan felt helpless. He didn't know what was going on, but he knew he couldn't let this continue. He couldn't stand the thought of his sister suffering in silence, night after night. He promised himself that he wouldn't give up until he figured out what was happening. "I'll be here when you're ready to talk," he said, his voice soft but firm. But I need you to know, Mia, you don't have to hide this from me. You don't have to go through it alone. Mia nodded, but Ethan could see that she wasn't convinced. She closed the door softly, leaving Ethan standing in the hallway, his mind racing with questions. What was happening to his sister? Why didn't she want anyone to know? Ethan couldn't rest until he found out the truth. But the answers were just out of reach, hiding in the darkness of the night. As he returned to his room, the sound of Mia's crying filled the silence again. Ethan's heart sank. He knew that whatever was going on, it was far worse than he had imagined, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could ignore it. Something had to change. But what was it? And who could Ethan trust to help him uncover the truth? The hidden truth. Ethan lay awake in his bed that night, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced, and his heart pounded as he replayed the conversation with Mia. He could still see the fear in her eyes, the way she had tried to hide the pain behind a forced smile. There was something she wasn't telling him. Something big. But what? He glanced at the clock on his bedside table. It was late, far too late to be awake. But sleep wouldn't come. The sound of Mia crying still echoed in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and Mia wasn't telling him the truth. He got up, quietly as he could, and crept down the hall toward Mia's room. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but his gut told him that something had to be hidden in that room. Maybe it wasn't just about the crying. Maybe there was something else, a secret, or maybe even a danger. Ethan stood outside her door for a moment, listening. The house was quiet, and for the first time in days, there was no sound of crying. Mia was asleep, or at least he hoped she was. But he couldn't just sit back and wait for her to tell him. Ethan knew that if he wanted answers, he'd have to take matters into his own hands. He slowly turned the handle and gently pushed the door open. The room was dark, but the soft light from the hallway spilled across Mia's bed. She was lying there, her face peaceful in sleep, but Ethan wasn't fooled. The night had been full of quiet sobs, and he wasn't about to ignore it anymore. He stepped inside, moving quietly so Mia wouldn't wake up. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of what might be causing the crying. There were the usual toys and clothes scattered around, but there was nothing out of place, nothing obvious. But something in the room felt off. Ethan's gaze landed on Mia's nightstand. There, tucked in the corner, was a small notebook. It wasn't there the last time he had looked. He approached the table carefully, trying not to make any noise. His fingers hovered over the notebook for a moment before he picked it up and flipped it open. The first page was filled with scribbled notes. Mia had always been a good student, and her handwriting was neat and careful. But these words were different, scratched out, messy, as if they had been written in a hurry. I can't take it anymore. He won't stop. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What did this mean? Who was Mia talking about? He quickly turned the pages, hoping to find more clues. But the further he went, the more his chest tightened. The entries were full of confusion, fear, and pain. There was mention of someone who Mia said had been hurting her, both physically and emotionally. Each sentence felt like a stab to Ethan's heart. He stopped at the last page, where Mia had written something that made his stomach drop. I don't want anyone to know. He says it will be worse if I tell. Please help me. Ethan could barely breathe. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was reading. Who was hurting his sister? Why hadn't Mia told anyone? Why was she keeping this secret? Before he could make sense of it all, the sound of a door creaking interrupted his thoughts. Ethan froze. He turned around slowly to see Mia standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. Her long brown hair was messy from sleep, and her face was pale. She looked terrified, as if she had just caught him doing something he shouldn't have. Mia, Ethan whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly closed the notebook and stuffed it under his shirt, but it was too late. Mia had already seen. She stepped into the room, shaking her head. Ethan, you weren't supposed to see that, she whispered. Please, don't tell anyone. Ethan's voice caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but he knew that Maya was scared. Whatever she was hiding, it was something that terrified her. "Mia, who is doing this to you? Why didn't you tell Mom or Dad?" he asked, his voice shaking. Mia's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step back. I can't. He'll hurt me more. I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan felt his anger rise, but he quickly pushed it down. Mia was in danger, and he had to help her. "Mia, I don't care what he says. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to keep this secret." Mia looked at him with pleading eyes, but Ethan could see the fear that gripped her. "You don't understand, Ethan. He said that if I tell, everything will get worse," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm scared." Ethan's heart broke for her. He knew that Mia was in deep trouble, and he wasn't going to sit back and let her suffer in silence. "Mia, you don't have to be afraid. I'm going to help you. But we need to tell someone. Mom, Dad, or the police. We can't just hide it anymore." Mia shook her head desperately. "No, please, Ethan, I can't." But Ethan wasn't going to back down. He knew he couldn't let this go on. His sister was in pain, and he had to protect her. He gently took her hands in his, looking her in the eyes. "Mia," he said softly but firmly, "I'm calling the police. We're going to stop him. You don't have to be scared anymore." Mia stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with doubt and fear. Finally, she nodded, barely able to speak. Okay, Ethan. But please, don't let him hurt me." Ethan held her close, promising her that everything would be okay. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to protect his sister. The call for help. Ethan stood there in his sister's room, holding her tightly as she trembled in his arms. His heart was racing, and his mind was full of questions that seemed impossible to answer. Who was this person hurting Mia? Why had she been keeping it a secret for so long? And most importantly, how could he stop this? Ethan knew he had to act quickly. His sister's safety was the most important thing now. He pulled away slightly and looked into her eyes. "Mia, I'm going to call the police. They'll help us. They'll make sure you're safe." Mia wiped her tears away, her face still full of fear. "Please, Ethan, don't. If you call them, he'll be angry. He'll hurt me even more," she whispered, her voice cracking. Ethan clenched his fists. He could see how scared she was, but he also knew that keeping this secret could make things worse. "Mia, I promise you, no one is going to hurt you anymore. I'm not going to let that happen. I'm doing this to protect you." For a long moment, Mia just stared at him, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Her breathing was uneven, and her shoulders trembled with the weight of her fear. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she finally nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay, call them. But please, don't let him find out." Ethan's heart broke as he looked at his sister. She had been living in fear for so long, and he had no idea how deep this pain ran. But it was time for it to stop. No more secrets. No more hiding. He was going to get her the help she needed. Taking a deep breath, Ethan reached for his phone, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed the number for the police. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice answered on the other end. 911. "What's your emergency?" Ethan's voice was steady, but he could hear the fear in his own words as he spoke. "My sister, she's been hurt. I need help. I think someone is hurting her, and I don't know what to do." "Okay, calm down, sir," the operator said, their voice surprisingly calm and reassuring. "Can you tell me what's going on?" Ethan glanced at Mia, who was sitting on her bed, staring down at her hands. She hadn't said anything, but he could tell that she was terrified. He knew he had to do this for her. "My sister, she's been crying every night. I found a notebook in her room, and it says someone's been hurting her. She's scared to tell anyone. but I can't let this go on anymore." The operator remained calm. "I understand. Stay with your sister. We're sending officers to your location right now. Are you in a safe place?" Ethan looked around the room, then back at Mia, who was now watching him closely. "Yes, we're safe right now," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But I'm scared for her. She doesn't want to tell anyone, and I don't know what to do." The operator's voice softened. "You did the right thing, sir. It's important that you got help. Stay on the line with me, and we'll make sure the police are there as soon as possible." Ethan nodded, though he knew the operator couldn't see him. He kept his eyes on Mia, whose face was pale, but she wasn't crying anymore. He could see the relief in her eyes, relief that he was doing something to help. But there was also still fear that this would only get worse. "I'm so sorry, Mia," Ethan said softly, walking back to sit beside her. "I know you didn't want this. I know you didn't want me to call the police. But we can't keep this secret anymore. You don't deserve this. And we're going to make sure you're safe." Mia didn't answer right away. She just nodded slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. She had been carrying this secret for so long, and now all of it was coming out. Ethan could see how much it weighed on her. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't chosen this life. Ethan stayed on the phone with the operator, who continued to reassure him that the police were on their way. But the minutes felt like hours. Every second that passed, Ethan's anxiety grew. He just wanted Mia to be safe. He wanted to make sure the person who had been hurting her would never come near her again. Finally, he heard the sound of sirens in the distance. His heart leaped with a mix of relief and fear. The police were here. They were going to help. But what would they find when they arrived? Who had been hurting Mia all this time? And would they be able to stop it before it was too late? As the sirens grew louder, Ethan stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath and turned to Mia, who was still sitting on her bed, staring at the floor. She looked so small, so vulnerable, but she wasn't alone anymore. Ethan was with her. "Mia," Ethan said softly, his voice full of determination. "We're going to make sure you're safe. Everything is going to be okay. I promise." She looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. But for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope in them. The police were here. And maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to get better. The shocking discovery. The sound of the sirens grew louder as the police car approached. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest, and his palms were sweating. His sister, Mia, sat on the bed, her hands clenched in her lap. She looked terrified, but she also seemed relieved that help was finally on the way. The doorbell rang. Ethan jumped, his nerves on edge. He took one last look at Mia before rushing to the door. When he opened it, 2 police officers stood in front of him. One was a tall man with a serious expression, and the other was a woman with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. They both wore their uniforms with authority, but the woman's soft voice put Ethan a little more at ease. "Are you Ethan?" the woman officer asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice tight with worry. "Please, come in. My sister, she's in there." The officers followed him inside, and Ethan pointed toward Mia's bedroom. Mia hadn't moved. She was still sitting on the bed, her eyes wide with fear. The woman officer walked over to her, kneeling down to her level, while the man officer stood by the door, keeping watch. "Mia, I'm Officer Jenkins," the woman said, her voice soothing. "We're here to help you. We just need you to tell us what's been happening." "You're safe now, okay?" Mia didn't respond right away. She looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with uncertainty. He walked over to her and knelt down beside her, taking her hand in his. "It's okay, Mia," Ethan whispered. "You don't have to be scared anymore. They're here to help. Just tell them what happened, please." Mia slowly nodded, her lips trembling. She glanced up at Officer Jenkins, then back at Ethan. The room was silent for a moment, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Mia finally took a deep breath and spoke in a voice so quiet that Ethan could barely hear her. He's been hurting me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to tell anyone, but I can't keep it inside anymore. Ethan felt a wave of anger and heartbreak crash over him. He squeezed Mia's hand, his jaw clenched. The man officer, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. Who has been hurting you, Mia? He asked, his voice firm but gentle. Mia hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. For a moment, Ethan thought she might not answer, but then she looked up at the officer, her face pale and stricken with fear. It's our stepdad, she finally whispered. He's been doing things to me when Mom isn't around. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing Mia say it out loud made his heart drop into his stomach. He could barely believe what he was hearing. The man who was supposed to protect them, to take care of them, had been the one hurting Mia all this time. Officer Jenkins's face softened, but her eyes were full of determination. Mia, you did the right thing by telling us. We're going to make sure he can't hurt you anymore. We'll take it from here, okay? Mia nodded, but Ethan could see the fear still in her eyes. She was terrified, and he knew that what she had just revealed would change everything. The officers quickly got to work. Officer Jenkins called for backup, and soon there were more officers arriving at the house. They carefully spoke with Ethan and Mia, gathering all the details they could to build their case. Ethan couldn't believe what was happening. This was real. The nightmare that Mia had been living was finally coming to an end. But there was still so much to process, so many unanswered questions. Mia's stepdad, who she had once trusted, was going to be arrested. Ethan wasn't sure what to feel. Part of him was relieved that Mia would finally be safe, but another part of him felt overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. How had he missed the signs? How had they both been living under the same roof? And he had never suspected the man they called family could do such terrible things. While the officers continued their investigation, Ethan stayed close to Mia. He held her hand, trying to reassure her, even though he didn't have all the answers himself. She was safe now, and that was the most important thing. But as the police took down notes and pictures, a sinking feeling began to settle in Ethan's chest. He knew that this was just the beginning. The path ahead was going to be long and difficult, but they would face it together. As the officers prepared to leave, Officer Jenkins turned to Ethan. We've taken down all the information we need, and we'll be pressing charges against your stepdad. He won't be able to hurt Mia anymore. Ethan nodded, though his mind was still racing. He wanted to feel relief, but all he could feel was anger and confusion. How could someone so close to them have been capable of such cruelty? Before the officers left, Officer Jenkins placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You did the right thing. Your sister is lucky to have you. Ethan didn't know what to say. He didn't feel lucky. He felt like his whole world had been turned upside down. But one thing was clear. He had done the right thing. Mia was going to be okay now. And nothing in this world would stop him from making sure she stayed safe. As the officers left the house and the door clicked shut behind them, Ethan sat down beside Mia again. They were finally alone, but the silence between them wasn't as heavy as it had been before. For the first time in a long time, Mia seemed to breathe a little easier. We're going to be okay, Mia, Ethan said softly. We're going to get through this. I promise. A frightening realization. The next day, everything felt different. The house, once filled with a quiet tension, now seemed to echo with the sounds of uncertainty. Ethan had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and what would come next. The police had promised Mia would be safe, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something far more sinister. Mia had stayed in her room all morning, too afraid to go anywhere or do anything. Ethan understood. After everything she had been through, it was hard to imagine how she could face the world outside. But Ethan knew she couldn't hide forever. They needed to face the truth, no matter how hard it was. As Ethan made his way to the kitchen, he could feel the weight of the day ahead pressing down on him. Their stepdad, who had been arrested, was now in custody. But that didn't make everything better. In fact, it only opened up more questions. How long had he been hurting Mia? How could they ever go back to normal? Ethan poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking slightly. He could still hear the words Mia had whispered to the police. "He's been doing things to me when Mom isn't around." Those words kept replaying in his mind, like a broken record. He couldn't understand how their mother hadn't known, how she hadn't noticed the signs. They had all been living under the same roof, yet none of them had seen it. None of them had known what Mia was going through. Ethan had always been close to Mia, but she had kept her pain hidden, trapped in silence. He felt a deep sense of guilt, a knot tightening in his stomach. How could he have missed it? As he stood in the kitchen, trying to gather his thoughts, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Mia standing in the doorway. Her eyes were red from crying, but she was standing tall, her chin lifted with a mixture of determination and fear. "Mia," Ethan said softly, his voice filled with concern. Mia didn't say anything at first. She just walked past him, her steps heavy as she headed toward the living room. Ethan followed her, unsure of what to say or do. He just wanted her to be okay. She sat down on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. Ethan sat beside her, but for a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unasked questions and emotions they weren't sure how to express. Finally, Mia broke the silence. "Ethan, do you think Mom will believe me?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she'll understand why I didn't tell her?" Ethan's heart broke at the sound of her voice. He took a deep breath before replying, trying to find the right words. "I hope no, Mia. I hope she will. But you did the right thing. You told the truth, and that's all that matters. You don't have to keep it inside anymore." Mia didn't respond right away. She just sat there, her face twisted in thought. Ethan could tell that she was scared of the unknown. She had just opened up about something so painful, and now she had to face the reality of what that meant. "I feel so stupid," Mia whispered. "I should have said something sooner. I should have told you or Mom." Ethan shook his head quickly, not wanting her to feel any more guilt than she already did. "Mia, you're not stupid. You're not to blame for any of this. You didn't have to tell me before you were ready. It's not your fault. And now that you've said something, things will start getting better. We'll get through this together." But even as Ethan spoke, a sinking feeling settled deep in his chest. He wasn't sure if Mia fully believed him. He wasn't even sure if he fully believed himself. Could things really get better? Could they ever go back to the way they were before all of this? Or had everything changed forever? Just then, there was a knock at the door. Ethan and Mia both turned, startled. Ethan stood up and walked toward the door, his heart racing. Who could it be? More police. Another surprise. When Ethan opened the door, he was surprised to find a familiar face standing there. It was their mother's best friend, Sarah, who had always been a comforting presence in their lives. But today, her face was serious, her eyes filled with concern. "Ethan," Sarah said, her voice low. "Can I come in?" Ethan stepped aside to let Sarah in. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew something wasn't right. Sarah's presence only seemed to confirm what he feared. "I just came by to check on you both," Sarah said, glancing over at Mia, who was still sitting on the couch. "I heard what happened, and I want you to know that I'm here for you." Mia looked up at Sarah, her eyes empty, as if she didn't know how to react. Sarah moved closer to her, sitting down beside her on the couch. Ethan stayed standing, watching the two women closely. "I'm really sorry, Mia," Sarah said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I had no idea what you were going through. I wish I had seen it. I wish I had known." Mia didn't say anything, but her face softened just a little bit. She hadn't expected to hear such compassion from Sarah, but it felt good to know that someone cared. Someone outside the family could see her pain. But even as Sarah spoke with kindness, Ethan's mind raced with questions. There was something in the way Sarah spoke, something in the way she looked at Mia, that made him uneasy. What if there was more to this than just their stepdad? What if there was more to the story that hadn't been uncovered yet? Ethan shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. This wasn't the time for doubt. Mia needed him. They both needed to face the truth, no matter how ugly it was. "Thank you for coming, Sarah," Ethan said quietly, trying to put his concerns aside for now. "It means a lot." But deep down, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the truth was far from over. The road ahead would be full of surprises, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was about to come next. Uncovering the layers. As the days passed, things didn't get any easier. Ethan found it harder to focus on anything other than Mia. He spent his days keeping an eye on her, making sure she was okay, but his mind was always racing. The weight of the situation was heavy, and it felt like it would never end. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional sob from Mia's room or the sounds of the phone ringing with more questions from the police. Their mother still hadn't come back. She had been called away for work shortly before the incident had happened, and Ethan hadn't heard from her since. He knew she would return soon, but he couldn't help feeling nervous about what would happen when she did. How would she react? Would she believe Mia? And would she blame Ethan for not seeing the signs earlier? The truth was, Ethan was scared. He had always felt protective of Mia, but now he realized that his sense of protection had been nothing more than a false illusion. There was so much more to the story than he had ever imagined. Mia had been brave enough to speak up, but Ethan had a feeling there was still more she hadn't said. Every time she looked at him, there was a hesitation in her eyes, as if there were pieces of the puzzle she hadn't been able to share. Ethan couldn't force her to talk, but the curiosity gnawed at him. He had to know the full truth. Mia needed to let go of whatever was still buried inside her. One evening after dinner, when the house was eerily quiet once again, Ethan decided to sit down with Mia. He knew it was time to have a conversation that had been a long time coming. It was time to peel back the layers. Mia was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a half-finished glass of water. Her eyes were distant, as if she wasn't fully there. Ethan had never seen her so broken, so fragile. His heart ached for her, but he knew this was the only way forward. "Mia," Ethan began, his voice gentle but firm. "We need to talk." She didn't look up at him immediately, but he could see her shoulders tense. She had been expecting this conversation, but she was afraid to face it. Ethan didn't push. He just waited. After a few moments, Maya finally looked up. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was a new determination in them. It was as if she knew this was her chance to finally speak the truth. "What do you want to know?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan took a deep breath. He wanted to ask everything, but he needed to start small. "I need to know what happened. All of it. You don't have to say everything right now, but I need to understand." Mia blinked rapidly, as if the words were hard to push through the tears. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she reached for the glass of water in front of her. "I don't even know where to start," she muttered, more to herself than to Ethan. Ethan sat down beside her, his heart heavy with worry. "It's okay. Start wherever you can." Mia stared down at her hands, as though they held the answers. She opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it again. Ethan could see the struggle in her eyes. It was like she was fighting with herself, torn between wanting to speak and wanting to protect the people she loved, even though they didn't deserve it. "Ethan," Maya said suddenly, her voice trembling, "I didn't want you to find out like this. I didn't want anyone to know what he was doing to me. I thought maybe I could just keep it all hidden, keep it inside, but I couldn't anymore." Ethan reached out and placed a hand gently on hers. "You don't have to keep it inside anymore, Mia. We're in this together. Mia nodded but didn't speak for a long moment. Then she finally exhaled, as if the weight of her words had become too much to bear. I didn't just hear him. I saw things. Things I didn't understand at first. Mia whispered, her voice shaky. He would come into my room late at night, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop him. Ethan's heart stopped. He could feel the bile rise in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, to comfort her, but the words wouldn't come. The shock of what she had just revealed hung in the air like a heavy fog. I tried to tell Mom once, Mia continued, her voice barely audible. But she didn't believe me. She thought I was just being dramatic. She said it was just my imagination. I don't think she ever saw it. Maybe she didn't want to. The final revelation. The following morning, Ethan felt a sense of urgency. It wasn't just the events of the past days that had him on edge. The truth, now that it was finally out, still felt incomplete. Something gnawed at him, pulling him into the uncertainty of what might still be lurking in the dark corners of their past. Mia had opened up, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she hadn't said. He knew there was still more to uncover, and if he was going to help his sister fully heal, they needed to confront the entire truth. The unanswered questions echoed in his mind. Who else had been involved? Had their mother known more than she'd let on? Why hadn't Mia been able to speak sooner? He glanced at Mia, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, looking out the window. The day was gray and overcast, as if even the sky was mourning the heavy weight of their circumstances. Her eyes were distant again, lost in thought. He could see the toll the conversation had taken on her. It was a relief that she had spoken her truth, but it was also clear that this was just the beginning of a long and painful journey for both of them. Ethan walked over and sat beside her, trying to offer some sense of comfort. Mia, he said softly, I know it's been hard, but we need to talk about something. I know you've been through so much, but I have to ask, is there anyone else? Was there anyone else who hurt you? Mia stiffened at the question. She didn't answer immediately, but Ethan could see her eyes searching for words. The silence stretched between them like a thick fog, and for a moment, Ethan worried that maybe he had asked the wrong question. But he couldn't stop now. He needed to know. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mia's voice broke through the quiet. I wasn't the only one, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan felt his heart stop. The air in the room seemed to freeze. What do you mean? He asked, his throat tightening. Mia turned to face him, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else in her gaze, something almost resigned. It wasn't just him. There were others, people in our lives. I don't think Mom knew. I don't think anyone knew. But it happened. And I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know if I should say anything. And when I did, no one believed me. But I know the truth now. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. The shock was overwhelming. He had known something terrible had happened, but the idea that others might have been involved, that others might have helped hide the truth, was more than he could bear. Maya looked down at her hands, her tears welling up again. I thought it was all my fault. Maybe if I had said something sooner, things would have been different. But I didn't. And now, I just feel so lost. Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. You didn't do anything wrong, Mia. None of this was your fault. Mia nodded, though the weight of her words seemed to hang over her like a dark cloud. I know, but it's hard to forget, you know. To let go of everything. Ethan wasn't sure what to say next. He knew that healing would take time, and he wasn't sure how long it would take for Mia to feel safe again. But he did know one thing for sure. They couldn't keep hiding from the truth. They couldn't let the past continue to control them. They needed to take action. We have to tell someone, Mia, Ethan said quietly. We have to let the truth come out. You're not alone. I'm here for you. And we can't let anyone else suffer like you did. Mia nodded again, a small, shaky smile crossing her face. It wasn't much, but it was something. "I'm scared, Ethan," she whispered. "What if no one believes us? What if they don't do anything?" Ethan felt a surge of determination. "We'll make them believe. We'll tell our story. We'll make sure no one else ever has to go through what you went through." They both knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be obstacles, and that the process of healing wouldn't be quick or easy. But Ethan also knew that they had taken the first step toward reclaiming their lives, toward turning the page on the darkness that had overshadowed them for so long. As they sat together, the weight of the situation hanging over them, Ethan realized one thing: the truth had power. It was the key to breaking free, to finding justice and healing. And with that truth, they would take the next step, no matter how hard it would be. But as the day stretched on, and the conversation came to a close, Ethan couldn't help but wonder, who else had been involved? Were there others who had hurt Mia, others who still walked free, hiding behind the walls of their own secrets? The truth was out, but the full picture was only beginning to unfold, and the journey ahead would demand courage, strength, and an unwavering commitment to fighting for justice, no matter the cost.